The letter was sitting on my doormat when I got back from shoveling the driveway on a Tuesday morning in January, and I almost missed it because my glasses had fogged up from the cold the second I stepped inside. I set down the shovel, peeled off my wet gloves, wiped my lenses, and then I saw it. A bright yellow envelope with the words "Formal Notice of Violation" stamped on the outside in red ink so aggressive it looked like the person who chose that font had a personal vendetta against me. I hadn't even had coffee yet. This was not how I wanted to start the day. My name is Mike Campbell. I own a 2-bedroom condo unit at Pinecrest Hollow, a mid-sized community of about 60 units in the kind of suburb where everyone has a Ring doorbell and strong opinions about landscaping. I had lived there for 4 years without a single serious complaint. I paid my HOA dues on time, I kept my unit clean, and I didn't throw parties that went past 10 on weeknights. I thought I was flying under the radar. I thought I was safe. I was wrong. I put on a pot of coffee, sat down at my kitchen table, and opened the envelope. Inside was a 2-page document printed on official HOA letterhead, and the first paragraph read as follows: Dear Mr. Campbell, it has come to the attention of the Pinecrest Hollow Homeowners Association that you are operating a portable propane heater on your balcony, which is in direct violation of HOA Community Standards Article 9, Section 4, Subsection B, as well as local fire codes. You are hereby required to remove said device within 48 hours or face a fine of $250 per day. There was a signature at the bottom: Sharon Blankenship. Board member, Pinecrest Hollow HOA. Of course it was Sharon. Let me tell you about Sharon Blankenship, because she is the kind of person who requires a proper introduction. Sharon had lived in Pinecrest Hollow for about 12 years and had been on the HOA board for the last 6 of them. She was somewhere in her mid-50s, and she had the particular energy of someone who had once expected life to deliver something grander and had decided to take out that disappointment on everyone around her. She drove a white SUV she never got dirty and wore fleece vests like it was a personality. She had a little notebook she carried around the property, and if she spotted something she didn't like, she'd write it down without saying a word to you. Just the scratch of a pen and a meaningful look, like she was an IRS auditor who also happened to be your neighbor. She had cited the guy in Unit 14 for having a welcome mat that was, and I quote, aesthetically inconsistent with community standards. She had filed a formal noise complaint against the woman in Unit 22 because her wind chimes could occasionally be heard from the parking lot. She had once sent a letter to a retired school teacher in Unit 38 informing him that his balcony potted plants were excessive in number and creating a cluttered appearance. The man had 4 flower pots. Sharon had photographed them from the parking lot with a zoom lens. But this situation with my propane heater, that was where I decided things were going to go differently. Let me explain how the heater even got onto my balcony in the first place. Back in early December, the building's central heating system had developed a problem. The boiler that served my wing of the building started running inconsistently, cycling on and off unpredictably, and some nights it simply didn't come on at all. My unit is on the 3rd floor corner position, and because of that I get wind exposure from 2 sides. When the boiler gave out overnight, the temperature inside my unit could drop into the low 50s by morning. I'm talking about sleeping in a wool hat and 2 pairs of socks kind of cold. I had contacted the property management company 3 times in writing and twice by phone. I had submitted a formal maintenance request. The response each time was some variation of "we're working on it" and "parts have been ordered." The parts took 3 weeks to arrive, and during that entire stretch of bitter January weather, I was dealing with a condo that alternated between barely warm and genuinely cold. I am not a dramatic person. I did not complain to my neighbors. I did not post angry things online. I bought a portable propane heater, one of those tabletop models you see on restaurant patios, set it up on my balcony because that is where the instructions said to use it outdoors, and I used it in the evenings when I wanted to sit outside for 30 minutes before bed without losing feeling in my fingers. That was it. That was the whole story. The heater was not inside my unit. It was not plugged into any building electrical system. It was a self-contained propane appliance sitting on my balcony in the fresh open air, exactly the way the manufacturer intended. I had used it maybe a dozen times over the course of about 3 weeks. And somehow, Sharon Blankenship had decided this was a crisis. I finished my coffee, pulled up the HOA's governing documents on my laptop, and spent the better part of the morning reading through them. Article 9, Section 4, Subsection B, I found it. It read as follows: no resident shall operate open-flame devices, including but not limited to charcoal grills, gas grills, or fire pits, on balconies, patios, or any shared outdoor space. Portable propane heaters were not specifically mentioned. The subsection was clearly written with cooking equipment in mind: grills and fire pits, the kind of things that produce flying embers and unattended flames over extended periods. A tabletop patio heater was a different category of appliance entirely. Then I looked up the actual local fire code. The city's fire prevention ordinance covered portable propane appliances and specified that they could be used on residential balconies provided they were kept a minimum distance of 3 feet from any combustible wall or ceiling, had a tip-over shutoff mechanism, and were not stored indoors with the propane cylinder attached. My heater had a tip-over shutoff. I had checked the measurements and it was more than 3 feet from the building wall, and I never brought the propane tank inside. I was compliant with the actual fire code. Sharon had cited me for violating local fire codes without apparently reading those fire codes. This was going to be interesting. I wrote back to Sharon that same afternoon. I kept the letter polite but specific. I stated that I had reviewed Article 9, Section 4, Subsection B, and noted that it applied to open-flame cooking devices and did not specifically reference portable patio heaters. I attached a copy of the City Fire Code Ordinance with the relevant section highlighted, noting that my heater was compliant with all specified requirements. I included the manufacturer's documentation confirming the tip-over shutoff mechanism. I also noted, in the final paragraph, that my use of the heater was a direct result of the building's central heating system having been non-functional for 3 weeks, a situation I had documented in writing through multiple service requests, and that I was happy to remove the heater the moment the building's heat was reliably restored. I walked the letter over to Sharon's unit, Unit 7 on the first floor, dropped it in her mailbox, and went home feeling like I had handled things like a reasonable adult. The next letter arrived within 24 hours. This one was less formal and more aggressive. Sharon had apparently not appreciated being cited back at. The new letter informed me that the board had met in an emergency session, which I was skeptical about given that it had been less than a day, and had determined that my heater posed a significant fire and safety risk to all residents of Pinecrest Hollow. It went on to say that regardless of the specific wording of Article 9, Section 4, Subsection B, the board had the authority under the general conduct provisions of the CC and RS to address any behavior deemed to be a hazard to the community. The fine had been doubled to $500 per day. There was also a new addition at the bottom, a handwritten note from Sharon that said, and I quote, "Mr. Campbell, if you do not comply immediately, we will be forced to escalate to the city fire marshal's office." Okay, Sharon. You want to escalate to the fire marshal. Fine. Let's escalate to the fire marshal. The next morning, before I did anything else, I called the city fire marshal's office directly. I explained the situation, described my heater and its placement, and asked them to send an inspector to evaluate whether I was in compliance with local fire codes. I want to be clear about why I did this. I wasn't being belligerent. I genuinely wanted an official third-party determination so that I had something definitive to stand on. If the fire marshal said my heater was a violation, I would remove it immediately, no argument. But if the fire marshal said it was fine, I was going to frame that determination and hang it on my wall. The inspector came out 2 days later on a Thursday afternoon. The weather was brutal that week, one of those stretches where the temperature hasn't climbed above 25 degrees in a week, and the snow from the last storm is still piled in gray, crusty mounds along the parking lot. The inspector, a compact middle-aged man named Officer Pratt, walked up to my unit with a clipboard and a measuring tape. I gave him a tour of the balcony. He measured the clearances. He checked the tip-over mechanism. He looked at the propane cylinder and how it was connected. He took some notes and then he turned to me and said, "This heater is compliant with municipal fire code. You're good." He wrote it up and handed me a copy of his inspection report right there. I thanked him, went inside, and made a photocopy before I had even taken off my coat. What Officer Pratt told me next was interesting. He said that the fire marshal's office had received a complaint about my unit from a third party, filed 2 days earlier, which had prompted them to schedule the inspection more quickly than usual. The complaint had described my heater as a direct fire hazard and claimed I was using it indoors with inadequate ventilation. None of that was true. Officer Pratt had seen for himself that the heater was outdoors, properly ventilated, and compliant with every applicable standard. He did note, in a professionally neutral tone, that whoever had filed that complaint had provided some inaccurate information. I asked him if he could tell me who filed the complaint. He said he wasn't able to disclose that officially, but that the record would be available through a public records request. I thanked him again, went back to my desk, and started typing that public records request immediately. While I was waiting for that to come back, I did something else. I pulled out my phone and started reviewing the security camera footage from my own unit. I have a small outdoor camera mounted on the corner of my balcony, one of those weatherproofed models, because the previous winter I had had some packages go missing from my front door, and I had set up a whole system. The balcony camera covers the balcony itself and has a partial view of the parking lot below. I started scrolling through the footage from the last week. There she was. On 2 separate evenings, Sharon Blankenship was visible in the parking lot below, standing and looking up toward my balcony with her phone raised, clearly taking photos or video. One of the clips showed her writing in that little notebook of hers immediately after. She hadn't said a word to me either time. She had just photographed my balcony in the dark, from the parking lot, without ever once knocking on my door to ask about the heater. I also noticed something else on the footage from the night before the fire marshal inspection. At around 11:15 p.m., there was a figure near the base of the building, below the staircase that leads up to the third-floor balcony access. The figure appeared to be looking up at my unit. The footage wasn't perfect at that distance in the dark, but the white SUV in the background was Sharon's. I couldn't prove she did anything that night, but it was something to note. The public records request came back 8 days later. The complaint filed with the fire marshal's office, the one describing my heater as being used indoors with inadequate ventilation, had been submitted by one Sharon A. Blankenship, and it had been filed under the anonymous tip option. Except the fire marshal's office records a submitter's contact information even for anonymous tips for follow-up purposes, and that information is subject to public records disclosure. So the tip wasn't so anonymous after all. Now I had the inspection report confirming compliance. I had camera footage of Sharon surveilling my balcony. I had documented evidence that she had filed a misleading complaint with the fire marshal's office, one that contained false information about where the heater was being used and how it was ventilated. I had her 2 letters with the escalating fines. I had my original documentation of the building's heating failure and the 3 weeks of unanswered maintenance requests. I called my neighbor Dave, who lives in Unit 19 and works as a paralegal. Dave and I had grabbed beers a few times over the years, and I trusted his judgment. I laid out the whole situation while we sat in his living room with mugs of tea, because honestly it was too cold for beer. He listened carefully, looked through the documents I brought, and then he sat back and said, "Mike, filing a false complaint with a municipal agency is not a small thing. Depending on how it's characterized, it could be considered filing a false report." He said I should at least consult with a property attorney, because I might also have a case for harassment given the escalating pattern of behavior. I took Dave's advice and called a property rights attorney named Greta Hollies, who I found through a referral from another neighbor. She did a consultation over the phone that lasted about 40 minutes. She agreed that the false fire marshal complaint was the most serious element, because it had been filed with a government agency and contained demonstrably false information. She said the HOA's escalating fines were also potentially problematic because the underlying citation was based on a misapplication of the CC and RS, and the board's emergency session had not followed proper notice procedures, meaning the doubled fine might not be enforceable at all. She offered to draft a formal response letter to the HOA on my behalf, which I agreed to have her do. The letter from Greta's office arrived at Sharon's mailbox, the HOA board's official address, and all 4 board members' personal mailboxes the following Tuesday. It was 6 pages long. It outlined the fire marshal inspection findings, attached the inspection report, cited the specific language of Article 9, Section 4, Subsection B, and explained why a portable patio heater did not fall under its provisions, challenged the procedural validity of the emergency board session, noted the pattern of targeted enforcement actions against my unit, attached the camera footage timestamps and descriptions of Sharon photographing my balcony on 2 separate evenings, attached the public records documentation showing that Sharon had filed a misleading complaint with the fire marshal, and formally demanded that all fines be rescinded immediately. It also put the HOA on notice that if they continued to pursue the fines or any further action related to the heater, my attorney would file for declaratory relief in civil court and would seek attorney's fees under the state's HOA dispute resolution statutes. The letter had exactly the effect you would expect. I heard nothing for 4 days, and then I started hearing from my neighbors. Unit 11, a retired firefighter named George Ostrowski, called me on a Friday evening to say he'd heard through the building grapevine that something was going on with the HOA and wanted to know if I needed backup. I gave him the summary version and he laughed, this big booming laugh, and said, "Sharon cited me last year because my outdoor Christmas lights had more than 48 bulbs. She said anything over 48 was excessive illumination under the holiday decorating guidelines." He paused. I looked it up. There is no holiday decorating guideline. Unit 26, a young woman named Priya who worked in insurance, had her own story. Sharon had tried to charge her an aesthetic violation fine for leaving her bicycle on her balcony overnight. Priya had pushed back and the fine had eventually been dropped, but she had screenshots of the entire email exchange, and she was more than willing to share them. Unit 31, an older couple named the Hendersons, told me Sharon had come to their door in November and told them verbally, not in writing, that they needed to replace their front door wreath because it was drooping. They had gone out and bought a new wreath. Only later had they wondered why they were spending $40 because their neighbor didn't like the look of their decorations. By the end of that weekend, I had spoken to 11 residents across the building. Every single one of them had a Sharon story. Some of them were minor annoyances. Some of them were things that clearly crossed a line, and taken together they painted a picture of someone who had used her HOA position as a personal power tool for years, selectively enforcing rules, sometimes inventing rules entirely, and intimidating neighbors into compliance through a combination of official-looking letters, vague threats, and the general anxiety people feel when they receive anything that looks like a legal document. I put together a group chat. I called it Pinecrest HOA Accountability, and within 3 days it had 27 members. Around this time, I also got the building's central heat fixed. The new boiler parts finally arrived. The maintenance crew came out on a bitter Wednesday morning when there were fresh inches of snow on the ground, and the temperature was in the low 20s. And by that evening, my unit was warm again for the first time in almost a month. I moved the propane heater off the balcony and stored it properly, not because Sharon told me to, but because I no longer needed it. The heater had done its job, and I had never been in violation of anything to begin with. A week after Greta's letter, I received a response from the HOA. It was not from Sharon directly, which was interesting. It came from a different board member, a man named Paul Wexler, who served as the board treasurer. His letter was carefully worded and notably free of the aggressive tone Sharon's letters had carried. It said the board had reviewed the matter and agreed that the fines were being rescinded in their entirety. It acknowledged that the original violation notice had been issued in error and that my heater had been compliant with applicable fire codes as confirmed by the fire marshal's inspection. It did not mention Sharon by name, and it did not acknowledge the false complaint she had filed with the fire marshal's office. That last part was the problem. Greta called me the day I received Paul's letter and told me what I was already thinking. The fines being dropped was a good outcome, but Sharon had filed a false report with a municipal agency. That didn't just go away because the HOA sent a walkback letter. Under state statute, knowingly filing a false complaint with a government agency, particularly one that results in an official inspection based on false premises, is a misdemeanor offense. It doesn't matter that the inspector found no violation. The act of filing the complaint with false information is the issue. Greta said she was going to refer the matter to the city attorney's office, along with the documentation we had. She said this was not about punishment for its own sake. It was about accountability for someone in a position of authority who had used that authority to file false information with a government office. The process needed to go through official channels. It did. About 2 weeks later, on a gray February morning when the snow had finally started melting in those streaky half-gone patches that look worse than fresh snow, I got a call from Greta. The city attorney had reviewed the documentation, including the public records disclosure of the false complaint, the fire marshal's inspection report confirming the inaccuracies in the complaint, and the pattern of behavior documented by multiple residents. They had decided to pursue a criminal referral. Sharon Blankenship was charged with filing a false report with a public official, a Class B misdemeanor under state law. She was cited and released, meaning she wasn't dramatically arrested in handcuffs in the parking lot, though I will admit the mental image was satisfying. She received a court summons and was required to appear. The word spread through Pinecrest Hollow faster than anything I had ever seen, including the time somebody backed into 4 cars in the parking lot and drove away. Within a day, everyone knew. The HOA group chat was busy. George from Unit 11 sent me a voice message that was mostly just him laughing for 12 seconds. Priya from Unit 26 texted to say she was putting together her own statement for the city attorney's office regarding the bicycle citation that had never actually been a rule. The Hendersons from Unit 31 mentioned their replacement teeth experience, and I told them to write it down. Meanwhile, the other 3 members of the HOA board quietly called an emergency meeting of their own, this one with proper notice as required by the bylaws, and they voted to suspend Sharon from her board position pending the outcome of the legal matter. Paul Wexler sent a letter to all 60 units explaining that the board was conducting an internal review of enforcement actions taken over the past 2 years and would be reaching out to any resident who had received a fine or violation, notice to evaluate whether those actions had been properly authorized. That review turned out to be more significant than anyone anticipated. Over the course of the review, the board discovered that Sharon had been issuing violation notices and fines under her name alone, without bringing them to the full board for approval, which was required by the bylaws for any fine above $50. She had done this with 14 separate violation notices over 18 months. Several of those fines had actually been paid by residents who hadn't known to push back. The total amount collected through improperly authorized fines came to just over $4,000. $4,000 that had gone into the HOA's general fund. Yes, but that had been collected through a process that violated the HOA's own governing documents. The board issued refunds to every resident who had paid an improperly authorized fine. The checks went out in March, right around the time the last of the stubborn snow was finally clearing from the parking lot. One resident, the retired schoolteacher with the 4 flower pots in Unit 38, received a refund check for $350. He told me later he had paid that fine without arguing because he didn't know he could push back and he didn't want trouble. He used the refund to buy a 5th flower pot, which I thought was an excellent choice. Sharon's court date was in late March. The charge was a Class B misdemeanor, and after consultation with her attorney, she entered a no-contest plea. The court imposed a fine of $800 and 1 year of probation, with the condition that she not hold any public or community governance position during that period. She resigned from the HOA board formally the day before her court appearance. By the time the snow was truly gone from Pinecrest Hollow and the first weak signs of spring were starting to show, the community had a new board composition with 2 new members elected from the general membership, including Priya from Unit 26 and George from Unit 11. George ran on a platform of, and I quote him directly, "common sense and leaving people's flower pots alone," which got a louder round of applause at the resident meeting than any platform I had ever heard delivered in a condo common room. The new board's first act was to review the CC and RS and publish a clear, plain language guide to what actually constituted a violation and what the proper process was for reporting and adjudicating one. It was 3 pages long, clearly formatted, and included an explicit note that residents had the right to respond to any violation notice and request a hearing before any fine was imposed. It was posted on the community bulletin board, emailed to all 60 units, and a printed copy was placed in every mailbox. The second act was to commission a proper inspection of the building's central heating system and negotiate a service contract with a local HVAC company that included guaranteed response times. The boiler situation that had started this whole thing, the one that had left my unit without heat for nearly a month in the middle of January, had apparently been a known issue that the property management company had been slow-walking for over a year. The new board terminated the contract with that management company and hired a different firm. Looking back on it, the whole thing had started because I sat on my balcony in the cold with a propane heater and Sharon Blankenship decided that was a problem. She could have come upstairs and knocked on my door. She could have asked me about it politely. She could have said, "Hey, I'm not sure about that heater, let me check the rules," and if I had found out I was in violation of something I would have dealt with it. That would have taken about 10 minutes. Instead, she went straight to formal violation letters, doubled fines, a misleading complaint to the fire marshal, and ultimately a misdemeanor charge. There's a specific kind of person who operates the way Sharon operated. They mistake authority for power and power for right. They've held a position long enough that they've stopped thinking about whether they're serving the community and started thinking about the community as something that serves their preferences. And the thing is, that kind of person usually gets away with it for a long time because most people don't push back. Most people just pay the fine, replace the wreath, take in the bicycle, and go on with their lives because the effort of fighting it seems too high. But sometimes you get somebody who sits down with a cup of coffee on a cold January morning, reads the fine print, pulls up the fire code, files the public records request, sets up the neighbor group chat, and decides that actually, no, this is not how it works. My propane heater is stored in my utility closet now, clean and ready for next winter if I need it. I won't need it for balcony use because the building's heat has been running perfectly since the new system was serviced, but I keep it around. It has sentimental value at this point. Dave from Unit 19 stopped by in late March on one of the first genuinely not freezing evenings of the year. We stood on my balcony for a while, just talking, watching the last patches of gray snow disappear from the parking lot below. He asked me if I ever thought the whole thing would spiral the way it did when I first read that yellow envelope. Honestly, not entirely. I knew Sharon was the type to push back hard when challenged. I knew she wouldn't just fold when I sent my initial response. But I also knew I was in the right, and being in the right with documented evidence is a fundamentally different position than being in the right and hoping someone believes you. The inspection report, the camera footage, the public records request, those weren't things I had assembled out of spite. They were just the truth, written down in forms that official processes recognize. The part I didn't anticipate was how many other people had their own Sharon stories and had been waiting for someone to give them a reason to tell them. When you're dealing with a bully in a position of authority, the loneliness of the experience is part of what makes it effective. You think you're the only one, you think maybe you're being oversensitive, you think it's easier to just comply. The group chat changed that. Once people started comparing notes, the pattern was undeniable and nobody felt alone in it anymore. George stopped by a few evenings later while I was putting away the last of my winter gear. He had brought a six-pack and we sat at my kitchen table for a while. He told me something that stuck with me. He said that back when he was a firefighter, the ones who caused the most problems weren't the people who didn't know the rules. They were the people who knew just enough of the rules to sound official while doing whatever they wanted. Sharon knew the HOA rules well enough to write impressive-looking letters. She just never expected anyone to actually read those letters with a highlighter and a copy of the city fire code open in the next browser tab. The new board held its first official resident meeting in April. It was held in the community room on the ground floor, which still smelled faintly of the old property management company's industrial carpet cleaner, but that was being addressed. About 40 of the 60 units were represented, which was apparently a record attendance. Paul Wexler, who had stayed on the board and seemed genuinely relieved to be operating in a functional environment, presented the new meeting structure and the updated community guidelines. Priya walked through the revised enforcement process step by step. George made a joke about flower pots that got the whole room laughing. There was a question period at the end, and one of the newer residents, a young couple who had just moved in that winter, raised their hand and asked what had brought about all the changes. There was a brief pause in the room and then someone pointed at me and said he had a propane heater on his balcony, which technically was accurate if somewhat reductive. I told the full version, the abbreviated version, and then Priya filled in the details about the fire code and the inspection and the false complaint. The couple sat there looking slightly stunned. The woman said quietly, "This happened because of a patio heater." And I said, "The heater was fine, it was always fine." The problem was never the heater. That was more or less the end of the formal drama, but I want to tell you about one more thing because it's the part I still think about sometimes. About 2 weeks after Sharon's court appearance, I was coming up the stairs to my unit with a bag of groceries, and I passed her in the hallway. It was the first time I had seen her in person since all of it had come to light. She was coming out of her own unit and we were going to have to walk past each other in the hallway whether we liked it or not. I wasn't going to be rude. I am not built for sustained hostility toward neighbors. It's exhausting and life is genuinely too short. She stopped when she saw me. She looked like she was deciding something, And then she said, in a voice that was smaller than I had ever heard from her, I may have overreacted. I thought about all of it for a second. The yellow envelope, the doubled fines, the false complaint filed in the dark while my camera quietly recorded her standing in the parking lot, the $4,000 improperly taken from 14 residents who hadn't known to fight back, the 4 flower pots, the 49 Christmas lights. I said, "Yeah, you did." And I walked past her and went inside and made dinner. She stayed in her unit through the spring. She didn't come to the April resident meeting. She didn't respond to the board's letters about the refunds. As far as I could tell, she had mostly gone quiet, and the community had moved on without her needing to be the center of it. The summer came and the balconies filled up with chairs and potted plants, and yes, several outdoor patio heaters belonging to various residents who had apparently been inspired by the whole affair to buy their own. Priya had a particularly nice one. She'd put up a string of lights too, well more than 48 bulbs, and they looked great. I asked the new board at one of the summer meetings whether the outdoor heater policy should be formally codified in the community guidelines, just so there was no ambiguity for future residents. They thought that was a reasonable idea. Priya drafted a clear, specific policy that distinguished between cooking devices with open flames, which remained prohibited on balconies for legitimate safety reasons, and UL-listed portable propane heaters with tip-over shutoffs, which were permitted subject to the manufacturer's specified clearance requirements and local fire code. The policy also referenced the fire marshal's standards directly, so any question could be resolved by checking an official external source rather than depending on one board member's personal interpretation. The policy passed unanimously and was added to the community handbook. George told me later that when he'd served on the election committee to fill the 2 vacant board seats, there had been some discussion about whether Sharon might try to run again once her probationary period ended. He said the consensus was that by the time any of that became possible, the community was sufficiently organized and informed that she would simply not win. 60 residents who had gotten refund checks, clear governing documents, and functioning heat were not going to vote someone back into authority who had spent years using that authority against them. He was right, as it turned out. The whole thing had taken a community that had been mostly disconnected, 60 individual units full of people who nodded to each other in the parking lot and not much more, and turned it into something that actually functioned like a neighborhood. The group chat was still active. People used it to coordinate snow clearing, to pass along the number for the good pizza place on the corner that doesn't show up on the delivery apps, to let neighbors know when a parking spot was about to open up, to ask if anyone had a hand truck they could borrow. Normal things. Neighborly things, the things that a community is actually supposed to do. None of that would have happened without the yellow envelope and Sharon Blankenship's very enthusiastic red stamp. I'm not grateful to Sharon exactly. What she did was genuinely harmful, to me, and to a lot of other people who'd been quietly paying her improperly issued fines for years. But I'm aware that the whole situation, in forcing me to actually engage with how the HOA worked and what the rules really said, produced an outcome that was better for everyone in the building. That's not Sharon's credit. That's the credit of everyone who showed up, shared their stories, and decided that this particular time they weren't going to just quietly replace the wreath. The following January, a year almost to the day after I first saw that yellow envelope on my doormat, we got the biggest snowstorm of the season. About 14 inches overnight, which shut down most of the roads in the area and turned the parking lot into a landscape that looked like a television show set in Antarctica. The property management company's new contract included snow removal, and the crew was there by 7 in the morning, which was a marked improvement over the previous year when we'd still been waiting for plows at noon. I got up early, made coffee, and went out onto my balcony to look at the snow. The whole community was white and still and genuinely beautiful in the particular way that a heavy overnight snowfall makes everything look before anyone has walked through it. My unit was warm. The heat was running. There was no yellow envelope on my doormat. I did not need the propane heater. But I thought about it, sitting there with my coffee in the cold, the way you sometimes think about a tool that served you well at exactly the right moment. That little tabletop heater had sat on my balcony through 3 weeks of broken building heat, keeping me warm on the evenings when I needed some air, doing exactly what it was designed to do, never posing any risk to anybody, never violating any code that actually existed. And when someone in a position of small authority had decided to use it as a weapon, it had, in a way, given back as good as it got. The propane heater had outlasted Sharon Blankenship's board membership, her fine-issuing authority, and her anonymous but not actually anonymous complaint to the fire marshal. It was still in my utility closet, perfectly functional, ready for next winter if needed. I finished my coffee, went inside, and started shoveling. My neighbors from several units came out within the next half hour, and we all worked our way through the parking lot together, clearing paths, checking on the older residents, laughing about how the snowdrifts had completely buried George's truck so that only the antenna was visible. By noon, the lot was clear, and we were all standing around with red cheeks and steam rising off our jackets, and someone produced a thermos of hot chocolate from somewhere and passed it around. It was a good neighborhood. It had been a good neighborhood all along. It just needed the right circumstances to prove it. And somewhere along the way, between the fire code and the public records request and the city attorney's office and the refund checks and the new community handbook, it had become the kind of neighborhood that could stay good going forward, because now everyone knew the rules, everyone had each other's numbers, and everyone understood that the authority to govern a community is borrowed from the community itself, and it can be taken back. I went back inside, hung up my coat, and checked the thermostat. 71 degrees. The heat was humming along perfectly. Outside the window, the snow was still falling lightly, the quiet kind of snowfall that comes after the big storm, just a few flakes drifting down to settle on top of everything else. It was a good day to be warm inside your own home, which is, when you think about it, all any of us ever actually wanted.